This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Yes, good evening. It's me, Ben Thomas, on the Tuesday Twilight show. Back again after a little hiatus for various reasons, really. I've got Becky Birchnough on the show tonight. We're going to be talking about core curriculum and all things English and maths, basically. So we're going to be getting into that in just a moment on the Tuesday Twilight show with me, Ben Thomas.
This is You are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Yes, good evening, everybody. I hope you're all good and having a good week so far. It's kind of crazy how the time goes, really, isn't it? It's quite frightening how quickly it all disappears. But we are well into March now, and we are very close to Easter, actually, in some situations in some schools up and down the country. I hope you're having a good week. We're back with the Tuesday Twilight show to talk about all things core curriculum. I've got a colleague of mine, luckily for her, I've managed to kind of rope her into the show this evening to talk about core curriculum and kind of the stuff that she does in school, really, and kind of how her experiences have led her to this point. So I'm hoping that she's on there. I think she is. Becky, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
You sound very different online. It's really interesting.
Oh, really? My phone voice.
I'm wondering, yeah, your phone voice. I'm wondering what I'm thinking, like, in terms of how my voice sounds. Maybe, do I sound like this when I'm teaching? I don't know. Yeah, so firstly, how are you?
Good. I think we're both getting over a cold, but we're getting past it.
Yeah, well, mine was definitely a lot worse than yours. So I'll take that one for sure. So we've onto the show, which has been quite good, really, because I've had, various guests, but I haven't had someone who has been kind of in charge of core curriculum solely. So it's good to kind of talk about all these things and kind of what you're doing with us, what that kind of looks like in our school, but also kind of your experiences, really. So kind of on that note, just give us a little background into, how long you've been teaching, what kind of experiences you've had, and the kind of the depth and breadth of your teaching experiences, basically.
Yeah, so I think this is my 8th year teaching. I kind of get confused going back through all the academic years, but so I think this is my 8th year. When I did a PGCE, and when I did my PGCE, I chose to do a maths specialist one because I was always interested in maths from quite early on. When I went to school, it was always my favourite subject. So I always did I chose to do a maths specialist course, and then I did my NQT year, which I think now is ECT year. And that was in Birmingham. So I did all my training and my first few years in Birmingham, and I joined a school, and it was in a very deprived area. Didn't know much about the school when I joined, and learnt very, very quickly, particularly as a teacher, because I had to. There wasn't a lot of structure in the school, and I learnt very, very quickly what I wanted to be as a teacher. And then I moved on from that school and joined another school, and at that school they didn't have a maths lead, so I quickly became a maths lead there, and that was in my 2nd year of teaching. So it was quite a big responsibility quite early on, but the head teacher was really brilliant. He helped me a lot with that, and I kind of shadowed him for the first few months. And I was always in upper key stage 2, but at that school I started to work a lot more in year 6, and did a lot of work with them, which is slightly different to the teaching that I'd done in all the other year groups. And then I relocated 4 years ago. Well, yeah, coming up to 4 years ago. And now I work with you, and I'm in charge of the core curriculum. I specifically look at maths and English, but I kind of curriculum lead as well. So I like to dip in and out of some of the other subjects.
Has it really been 4 years?
This is my 4th year. Yeah.
Wow, I can't
Yeah,
believe it.
Yeah, I
The
think.
stuff we've been through in 4 years. I mean, I say this obviously, to Louisa about stuff, but we could write a book at some point, in terms of all the stuff that we've been through. So, yeah, quite interesting. So obviously we're part of a MAT now, in terms of school we work in. Were you always part of the particular trust, or did you start off in like an LEA school and then move to the trust?
Yeah, so I started off in an LEA school, and that was my first year and a half, and then I moved to the trust that we're with now, and then I've always been working for that same trust.
Okay. And I guess like it's tricky, isn't it? Because I joined this particular trust. Like you, I lose a year, maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago. I can't remember, to be honest. It seems like a long time ago. It probably is, really. But it's one of those things where I think it's really good that people have experiences of working for both. If you're in kind of the state sector, you're working for LEA, but also MAT schools as well, if that's what you want to go down. So it's really, really good that there's an opportunity to be able to to get that mix up, really, which is quite cool. So obviously you relocated to arguably one of the greatest places on earth in Reading, which is where we currently are in terms of coming to you live. How did you find the move, like geography wise, but also just in terms of the way that, when you joined our school, how we were doing things compared to your previous setting? How was that?
Yeah, so the move was quite a shock for me, because I'm originally from North Wales. This is as far south as I think I've been.
And there's little snippets of your accent come into your teaching sometimes, which is really funny. Just like, I wonder what word she's going to come out with, and and go for it. So yeah, it's quite interesting listening to you. Really, it's
yeah. I think I get used as an example quite a lot in phonics, because I do different sounds. But yeah, so I really enjoyed Birmingham, and I moved there when I went to university. I really enjoyed living in that city, and then I moved here, and I do enjoy it. I do like it down here, but it was a bit of a shock at first. In terms of like the school, I'd say the first school that I worked in, which is a local authority school, that's more similar to the school we were in now.
Okay.
It was really high levels of children with EAL. It was in a deprived area. We had quite a lot of different kind of cultures and different mixes, and it was more similar to this one now. And then the school I went to, second school I went to in Birmingham, that had a different kind of context around it as well, because in Birmingham it was kind of on the border between two different areas in Birmingham, and you got influences from both areas, and that was really interesting to have in the classroom. And we had lots of different discussions around that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's teaching is one of those things where, it sounds obvious, but it's such a transferable skill. And, you could take a school in, I don't know, Brighton and kind of almost replicate it in Rotherham, for example. Like the challenges are going to be very, very similar in kind of a lot of areas of the country. But I think, certainly in my experience of working with people that have relocated, like sometimes you forget the human toll in terms of actually going, right, I've just literally left an area that I was really comfortable with, and now I'm like, bang, dropped into this area that I don't really know, but I've also got to get to know the kids and the area and the parents and everything else.
Yeah,
so
you really want to get to know the families. Because you kind of build that relationship with the families. If you teach the siblings and things like that, you start to really get to know them. And one of the biggest things that I found that I kind of didn't expect being in year 6 was, obviously they find out about their secondary schools, and that for that first year that I'd moved to Reading, and they were telling me these secondary schools, and I had no idea of where these schools were, because I'd just moved there. So it was very kind of difficult in that sense of just trying to get my own geography of the place. But yeah, that's something I've kind of
and you sort of end up doing like a drive round, don't you, in terms of like the local area and kind of where these kids are going and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, all that is really, really important kind of contextual information.
Yeah,
Give us a little bit of a
absolutely.
spoiler.
Just so you can hold the conversation.
Yeah, exactly, and like get excited with them and commiserate with them in some cases. I guess I don't know, but so you kind of little bit of a spoiler there. You mentioned that you work in or are currently teaching a year 6 class. What
Yes.
you talked about your your experiences leading up to this point. What, for those people that don't know you, what does your current role look like at the moment?
So currently, I think the biggest part of my day at the moment is teaching year 6. That is kind of where I'm based. And then my overall as curriculum lead is I lead the English and the maths, so reading, writing and maths. And then it's the support and development of the curriculum leaders as well for all of the wider curriculum subjects. And kind of making sure that they are confident and have ownership of their subject too.
I mean, we'll kind of get into what that looks like a little bit more later on, but in terms of if we focus on the year 6 element for a minute, how since kind of COVID and the pandemic, well, not COVID because it's still around, but the pandemic and the lockdown, how have you found the kind of the whole process of the assessment element of being in year 6? Because I remember we kind of sat there and we was like, oh, it's going to change and it's all going to be different, but nothing really has it?
No, it's different. It's funny how quickly things have kind of gone back, because when I first moved to Reading, that would have been the first year that we didn't do SATs. And I remember you coming into my classroom and saying that, the schools were going to close and things like that, and the pandemic, and, what impact that would have on the SATs and these children's end of key stage assessments. And then, the following year, also not having them. And then last year, then going back to doing SATs, and how we can make sure that we acknowledge that the pandemic did happen and that it did have an impact for these children, but they still had that expectation of the assessment at the end of Key Stage 2. And so did Year 2, and, how we can kind of support and navigate around that, because you have to recognise that a huge pandemic did happen for these children, and the expectations that they had upon them as well.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole separate show on kind of assessment in school since the pandemic. Maybe that is a really good show we could do potentially. I don't know, but in terms of how things have moved forward, it's almost gone like for like in terms of what it was previously. So it's forgetting the fact I work with you. If I was doing this podcast with someone I didn't know and they said, "Oh, I'm a year 6 teacher and I lead core curriculum across the school," they're not small tasks, are they? And that's not me saying, oh, well, no one else in the school works hard, because that's not the case at all. But in terms of the two chunky parts of school life, those things are quite big, right?
Yeah, they are quite big. They are two very separate roles as well, but they kind of merge in different ways. But yeah, they are big roles in school. And like you said, everyone works hard, so it's just about trying to use that a little bit as well, and make sure that each class and each child is getting what they deserve to have, really. So yeah, it's hard to kind of navigate. It's not an easy thing to do both roles, but I think because that's where my passion lied, and where I kind of set myself up from the beginning, particularly with maths, that I'm quite driven and interested in around it, and it's what I'm reading about and things like that. So
yeah, well, I mean, let's focus in on a little bit of that passion, really, because obviously it's very evident. I don't want to keep banging on about it, but obviously I see you day to day. I see what the kids produce, and I see how you run things. So it's very evident maths is for you. In terms of when you started out as a kind of a core curriculum lead, was it one of those situations where they went, all right, well, you can do maths, but you can also just do English as well? Or did you kind of, pitch ideas to do English? Did it kind of happen organically? Like, how did that come about, really?
Yeah, so when I first started out in Birmingham, I was just maths lead, and that kind of developed from, I had that passion originally, and that had come from back when I was in school. I'd always loved maths. I quite liked the structure of it. I liked my teachers in maths. I liked the lessons that I had in maths. So I always had that, and I kind of wanted to share that because I was my undergraduate degree was all on childhood and teaching and education, and I was with my peers who a lot of them went on to be teachers, and I was quite aware of the fact that it wasn't always like that for teachers, that they didn't always favour maths in that way at school. And I did, so I kind of wanted to show that, and that it doesn't have to be difficult all the time, and it doesn't have to be this kind of big subject. And then, when I was at that school, I was really lucky that the year 6 teacher that I was then working very closely with as I developed more into year 6, she was the English lead, and I learnt so much from her, and her leadership of English and the grasp that she had of the subject. She was incredibly knowledgeable about the subject knowledge, but also the way that she could break it down and how she could make it into different steps and communicate that with the children and the staff and make it a really accessible subject. Because for me, that was the subject that I found most difficult. So when I kind of saw her do that, I was really inspired by it. And then when I came to the school we're at now, and speaking to some of the leaders there, they said about the opportunity for English as well. And I kind of jumped at the opportunity a little bit because I felt like I'd learned so much previously, and I wanted to start doing a little bit of this myself, and trying out these different ideas and making them apply to the children that we had at our school to make it meet their needs, and how it could be kind of the same but a little bit different at the same time, so that it was really for them and where they were coming from and the experiences that they had had. So then I kind of jumped at that opportunity, still loved maths and really passionate about teaching year 6, so kind of just ended up doing all 3.
You just crack on and do all 3. It'll be fine. You won't be tired or anything. It'll work really well. I think it's funny, isn't it, about maths, because for a subject that's basically so black and white and rigid, there's actually a lot of flexibility in how you present those ideas. And obviously, if I think back to my time when I first started as a NQT, that's ECT if you are new to the profession and you are currently an ECT. We used a scheme called Abacus, which was basically like pick up the textbook, page whatever, activity, A for these kids and B for these and so on. And it was all on like a laminated sheet. And it was just really bizarre because you'd lift, in those days, like people were hell bent on producing, reams and reams of paper planning and all this sort of stuff. But you'd literally just copy and paste the document from Abacus and stick it into your maths plan. And a lot of things I'd look back and go, how did people ever get away with that? Because, there's no flexibility in that. That's just literally teaching to type. So I think you're right. There is a lot of really good maths practitioners out there, and I think it often is the case that when you've had good experiences, certainly in secondary school, you've had good teachers for maths and people have shown you different ways of solving problems, that kind of sticks with you. And you'd think actually like writing's a bit more creative, fluid, but actually, in the last sort of 5-6 years, I'd say that probably maths is potentially on a par, maybe even overtaken in some situations. What with the grammar expectations and the kind of the quantifying of different subjects within that. So it's an interesting one, and I think the thing people forget is that you can be a core curriculum, but the subjects in a lot of respects are very, very different, and they require different levels of input with people. But the thing about it, and I was always amazed with people that are, that manage core curriculum in schools, is that you have to keep on it all the time because it's such a regular occurrence in a school day. You'd end up teaching what, 5-6 maths lessons a week probably. Same with writing, same with reading, depending on whether you're in interventions. Whereas if you're kind of looking after geography, and I'm not intending to upset any geography leaders that might be listening, but that might be taught on a termly basis, that might be taught once a week. So it's kind of the input and the focus on those 3 subjects is quite intense, right?
Yeah, and I also think that's kind of what's exciting about it, because there's so much focus on it, and you're spending so much time of your day and on the timetable. The children really make such progress, and the progression from when they come in at nursery or reception and when they leave at year 6, because so much time and energy has gone into those subjects. It's amazing the progress that they can make, and what some of the expectations of some of the year 6 children now of what they can produce. And particularly sometimes I think it stands out with writing. Some of the writing that these children can produce is really outstanding. And I think that's kind of, because of so much going into those subjects. And I think that's kind of what's a little bit exciting about it. But yeah, you're 100% right that it's always going to be a focus of the school. Particularly, I'll mention Ofsted first, but with the new frameworks and things, reading is everywhere and everything. If you can't access the reading, then you're going to struggle with the rest of the curriculum. So I think it really does show the importance of these subjects, and why so much time is on them. But you're right, you have to be on it because they are going to be incredibly important subjects.
And I guess as well, like in some respects, and we'll kind of come on to challenges in a bit, but it kind of depends on the experiences and the career levels of the people you're working with, because some people might need, a light touch. Some people might need quite an intensive course of, this is how we're going to teach it, this is what your kids are going to access in your class, and so on and so on and so on. So I guess, from your point of view and other core curriculum leaders' point of view, it's really dependent on you being clear on your expectations and then making sure that people follow them, basically. So in terms of the monitoring, I always found it when I did the core curriculum, I found the monitoring the most time, because not only have you got to kind of walk in for a period of lesson or lesson times or whatever, but actually you've got to go in and kind of really feedback and kind of go, look, you can improve this element, you can do this, you can do that. So it's difficult. It's a really difficult role. And I think when you're teaching full time, whether that's in year 6, year 1, whatever, it's an intensive, part of school life, really.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of where you're at now and what you're doing, kind of what would you say are the challenges of what you're doing at the moment? I guess that's the key point, really, in terms of how that's running and how that looks in terms of your day-to-day professional life. What are the key challenges that you face? And obviously, don't say me.
So I think because of where we're at, like you said, it's not about implementing whole new structures. It's not about implementing new curriculums. You kind of mentioned Abacus and the different schemes that you can have. And obviously, particularly with maths, there's a whole wide range of schemes you can buy into. We're not at that stage. We're, we know what we're doing and we've got those systems in place. But like you kind of suggested, it's more about the monitoring and the upkeep and making sure that you are maintaining those standards. And it is very different for the different teachers that you have in the school, and also the different year groups, because each year group comes with different challenges. So it is, more time consuming in the fact that you're probably going to be giving more individualized feedback. It's not whole school kind of applicable feedback. You're going to be going in and monitoring and things like that. And I think one of the biggest changes that I've definitely seen over the 8 years as a maths lead is the focus of that monitoring, the very first Ofsted that I went through, which was in my NQT year or my ECT year, there was no interest in talking to the pupils, or sitting with the pupils and their books and having that conversation with them around their learning. It was very much we're going to watch your lesson, we're going to grade your lesson, and we'll do that to you. It wasn't really done with you. And I remember those experiences, and now I think back and I think how different it is now, how I conduct my monitoring and going in and talking to the pupils. And I might take a small group of them with their books and kind of ask them about how their maths is going, or their reading, or what are they reading, what are they writing, and also feeding back those conversations to the staff, because sometimes what the children have got out of it is very interesting.
Yeah, I think that is interesting about Ofsted, because I'm not going to be an Ofsted apologist here. I mean, I've had good and bad experiences with them, but I think you're right in terms of the methodology behind analysing a particular part of the core curriculum. There is a lot more focus on talking to the children, and I think that's kind of filtered through all the way in terms of actual whole school monitoring and kind of the way in which and internal adults interact with those children. I think that's a really good change and a really important one, really. I'm gonna play a message from our sponsors, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about kind of the difference between implementing and then maintaining parts of the core curriculum. So don't go anywhere.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
Happy reading indeed. So we're gonna have a little chat about, not too much about where we are as a school, because obviously we both know, hopefully, but kind of the difference between implementing a big change, and kind of going, right, we're going to take on X scheme of work for maths, or we're going to follow this particular reading pattern all the way through our school, as opposed to kind of introducing it and then maintaining it. So I know from working with you over the last 4 years, which I still can't believe really, that you've had an opportunity to do both. I suppose the easy question, or the straightforward question, the closed question, is implementing it or maintaining it.
So I think when it comes to the implementation, particularly I think when you're choosing those schemes, it's always about the intent, and that's got to be the focus of what are your intentions with these, and do they match the context that you're in? And then I think when it comes to maintaining it, everybody's on board with your intent and everybody understands your intent, or hopefully they would do if you've implemented it properly. And then it's about refining it, and it's about making sure that you're getting the most out of it. You're making it the most efficient and the most effective as it can be. Particularly when we think about teacher workload and we think about different things going on in the schools and the different pressures that we've got, you want to make it as efficient and as effective as it can be. And I think then it comes down to the CPD that you're giving and the quality CPD that's actually applicable for each member of staff. So both come with their challenges, I think.
I think it's kind of, as I've got older and kind of more experienced, the more you realise that kind of managing and running a school and kind of managing any subject is exactly like having a class with more opinions, I guess, because actually, what you're doing, as you say there, is like you're looking at people and going, okay, but they're going to need a bit more of this person's going to need a bit less of this, but it always comes back, what your children are in a classroom, whatever academic ability they're working at, that it does come down to the intent. in terms of how you're going to get across, the hows and whys and the reasons for doing it in a certain way. And I guess in your thinking about your career, have you ever come up against, like a lot of resistance when you're changing things? Or have you had people maybe kind of on SLT or in the school where they're kind of persuading you to do things in a certain way by taking on schemes or whatever?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely been times in my career where it's been more challenging when you want to make those changes. Becoming a maths lead in my second year, I was less experienced and I was younger than a lot of the people I was working with. And that definitely came across as some of the challenges that I had, because I was in a school where, people had been working in that school for a long, long time, and they knew the children inside out. And, they were very much like, well, why do we have to go through the change, or just kind of wanting to delve into it a little bit deeper. And then so that was one of the challenges that I've definitely faced. But I think as long as you know why you want to do it, and you can communicate that, I think I've been really lucky in the sense that people have kind of got on board with that. And then I think definitely, I've been working as, like you said, in an SLT where there's different opinions on schemes of work and things like that. And I've used the same scheme of work in different schools, and I've seen how it can be a brilliant scheme of work that meets the needs of the children, and it works really, really well. And then I can use the same scheme and it not work as well. And I think that's why you've really got to come back to the intent and looking at the context that you're in, and, like you said, almost analysing it like a class of what are the needs here, and does it meet those specific needs.
Yeah, I mean, it's it is a tough one, isn't it? Because I obviously when I was writing questions for you in a kind of a loose agenda, I kind of thought, actually, do you know what? It's a lot harder to, or I feel in my experience, to maintain something and to go, okay, well, we're at this point, it's working, so well or whatever. How are we going to get it to the next stage, and kind of moving that, that good to great scenario to kind of thing, in terms of how we move stuff forward. I think my only conclusion that I can draw from that, tough question is that actually it's really about your staff and how motivated they are to kind of not rest on their laurels and to kind of to move the whole thing forward, not just for themselves, but obviously more importantly for the children and the kind of the ethos of the school, really. So I think it's my only conclusion that I can draw from that is it kind of depends on the setting and where schools are at in terms of their journey to be able to improve standards or obviously maintain standards as well, really.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of how you've coped with those different stages of implementing and maintaining, you talk briefly about when you're implementing, it's really important you get the vision across. It's really important that you talk about the intent. Schools will call it roadmap, plans, whatever it is. What kind of tips have you got for people that might be listening to this and considering or looking to want to do a core curriculum leadership in the future, or are currently kind of early on in their career in terms of core curriculum leadership? What tips would you give them to implement something first of all?
I think you've really got to kind of dive deep into what are you trying to do with your core curriculum, and what is the context of your school and the setting that you're at and the staff that you're working with. And I think once you know that inside out, then and back to front and everything, you'll kind of be able to make those changes or see those changes that you want to make. I think definitely spending time in just exploring the different options that you've got, and the needs that you've got, and the different options you've got in terms of if you're going to be bringing in a scheme, if that's the change you're going to be implementing. and really exploring those in depth, because kind of once you're with a scheme, you're going to be sticking with that scheme. So you want to make sure that it really is going to meet the needs that you've got in your school and for your staff, and that you can articulate that with them as well. I've been very lucky with the staff that I've worked with. Like you said, you want to be working with staff that aren't going to rest on their laurels when they're maintaining things, or that they're open to these changes. And in my past experience, I think if you can communicate the expectations and you can communicate why you want to make those changes, staff will be on board with you, and that motivates them too.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's like going on that journey, isn't it? Really, I guess in terms of how you articulate things, how you want to move things forward. Really, in terms of then kind of maintaining those standards, like what's your top tips for that? Because as I said earlier, I kind of feel like that is more difficult, to be able to maintain those standards, to be able to go, okay, we're here. How do we get higher up? What's our process for that? So what kind of tips have you got to kind of share for maintaining standards?
Yeah, I think, like you've said, I think it is more tricky, because it's very easy to kind of, go, everything's great, this is working really great. But in terms of maintaining the standards, I think you've got to be really, really focused with what you're monitoring, and what you're kind of looking for in your monitoring. And if you're going to do the pupil voice, or you're going to be looking in books, what specific things are you looking for? Because then if you've got specific things that you're looking for, you can give that specific feedback. And like we before, the feedback is going to be very individualized at this point, because you're going to have teachers who need that light touch, and you're going to have teachers that you kind of are going to need to give more support to. And if you're really specific with what you've got in your monitoring, and you can give that specific feedback, you can meet the needs of those teachers as well, and you can make sure that their standards are high, and maintaining those high standards as well. And it's not about overhauling things, but it's not about letting it go stagnant either. It's about making sure that you're constantly kind of trying to get that extra 10% out of those subjects.
I think that's the thing as well, is that you don't want it to get, so you could follow a scheme of work for maths, for example, and I'm not going to mention any because it's not a sponsored show. If we accidentally do, it's not because we're pitching for them, it's just because it comes up in conversation, just so people are clear on that. But like in terms of the structure of some of the lessons within those schemes that are available to purchase, if you wish, it's kind of making sure that, okay, this is the structure, this is what we expect as a whole school, but actually we don't want it to get boring for our pupils. And I think, obvious thing to say, but the best teachers I've ever seen are people that are really engaged and have a passion for what they're doing, really. In terms of when you are monitoring, particularly in the stage of your career at the moment, where you're kind of maintaining a particular ethos, a particular mindset, what for you is the most important part of knowing that what you're doing is working? Don't say Ofsted, obviously, but like,
no, not Ofsted. I think
for you.
Yeah, I think definitely one of the most rewarding things that happens is when I am doing my monitoring and I am talking to the pupils. You see how much they love learning that subject, and you see how proud they are of the achievements that they've made in that subject. And that definitely, spurs me on to keep striving for that, really, because that's at the end of the day why we're here. And monitoring does give you that opportunity to kind of sit back and reflect and actually see these children and how far they have come, especially if you know them maybe historically, or you've seen how the journey that those individuals have gone on, and that's because they've now got that curriculum that's meeting their needs, and they've got teachers that are confident with what they are delivering, and passionate, like you said, passionate about what they're delivering. And kind of like you hinted at there's lots of schemes particularly for the core subjects that you can purchase, and And it's really important sometimes that you do have that structure. One of the things that I've definitely found in my experience is that the pupils like to know what they're expecting. They can kind of expect their maths lesson's going to look a little bit like this, or their writing lesson's going to look a bit like this, because that gives them the confidence that they need sometimes. But yeah, like you said, teachers also need to have that confidence to go, hang on a minute, this is what we need to do. And we can do that because that's going to meet those children's needs. And then it all culminates then when you do your monitoring, you see those children and they're proud of everything that they've done, or, you know, their opinion of a subject has changed, or that they can talk about how they've been helped in that subject.
I think, you know, always focusing on the experiences of people that are doing it day in, day out is obviously the most important thing about it. I think, you know, certainly in my experience, there are easier ones to monitor in terms of, you know, success rates and attainment and how kind of things are moving, probably a bit more formulaic than maybe other areas of the core curriculum. I mean, in terms of where you're at and what you do, out of the three, so maths, writing, and reading, I nearly forgot then. Nearly said phonics. That would have been a disaster. You know, in terms of those three, which ones do you find, you know, the most rewarding to monitor and kind of analyze, I guess, and which one out of those three do you think, actually, do you know what, it's a little bit more tricky because of XYZ?
I think it is quite specific to the setting. Definitely where I am, I think the ones that I find most rewarding are the maths and the reading. Maths I find really rewarding because we've made some changes to maths and I can see that the impact that those changes are having. And like you said about the people who teach them day in, day out, and I can see how it's more effective and more efficient for those people, and how the children are getting so much more out of it. So that's definitely quite easy to monitor because there's been a specific change and you can see the impact that that change has had. In terms of the reading, I think that's also really powerful to monitor and kind of get information about, because it's such a big subject and it's so all encompassing. There's children who are going to really love non-fiction, and there's children that are going to love fiction or different things about there's something there for everybody to like. They just have to find it. So you can always have those conversations with the children because it's just about opening up different experiences and different worlds to them through reading. And once you're kind of teaching those reading skills, then more and more experiences become available to them. I think with writing, like you said, it's kind of become a little bit different as, you know, a subject, and the focus on the grammar and the spellings and things like that, it can be a little bit more difficult to monitor sometimes, because it covers so much. There's so much that is kind of covered in that subject, and how closely it is linked to reading and how closely it's linked to the experiences that the children have, and how that can impact on their writing and the different things that they can write about and the vocabulary that they have and their confidence with writing about different things as well.
I think writing always for me was tricky because it was, and it still is, you know, to a point. It's very ambiguous. It's very open to interpretation. It's very personal in terms of how people, you know, class teacher invested in their children and the life experiences they've had. And I distinctly remember being an NQT and we'd have fairly regular writing moderation sessions. You know, it was a 3-form entry school. And I remember doing that as a whole kind of staff. And these things were going for hours. Like it would almost end in like fist fights because people were like, no, if you look at this grid, it says this and blah, blah, blah. And people like really kind of going to bat for their kids in terms of where they personally felt they were. And then someone would chip in with, you know, difference of opinion and all this sort of stuff. I think now it's a little bit easier because of the importance, but the kind of the greater scrutiny and the greater kind of rigidity that you have with grammar and kind of the assessment there. But in some respects, I think it is a lot harder because I feel like the teaching profession and teachers in general have to give a lot more in writing because the life experiences of children, and I know it depends on the area that you teach in and, you know, where you are in terms of an economic area, but children don't have or seem to have the same life experiences that they had, which kind of helps to writing and helps to vocabulary and kind of the whole environment that they kind of live in, really. So I feel like teachers really do have to work a lot harder to get across the meeting and the way that they're presenting, which I guess has a knock-on effect to how you monitor it, and how you judge assessment of those teachers, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think definitely with the writing, there's still, open to interpretation, and I still go to different moderation meetings, and there's still people who have different opinions. But yeah, I think one of the biggest barriers that people face is that those life experiences might not be there. And the vocabulary that they bring to the children, and particularly when we look at things like greater depth and the expectations there, these children have to have such creativity and flair with their writing, and they can only get that through different experiences and reading as well, and the opportunities that they have for reading and the different books that they've got. So yeah, it's really kind of closely linked with so many different areas. And to spend a lot of time on writing, you've also got to get a subject that these children have experience of, but also that they're interested in and that they're passionate enough to write about. And that can be quite difficult when you've got a whole class of 30 children and you're trying to inspire them all to do this piece of writing that you want to get them to write. So there can be lots of different barriers to writing, and I think it is difficult in that sense. And then you can have those different subjective views on it of which where they can write. And I think because of that, and because of the scope of writing, we've got some brilliant writers who can really struggle with spelling, or you've got some brilliant writers who can really struggle just getting it down on a page and handwriting, and the scope of the subject means that it is a little bit trickier.
It's almost like the system stifles creativity, isn't it? Honestly, who would have thought that would have been the case? Just before we go to news, because we're kind of about halfway through, incredibly, we're approaching 50 minutes, which is quite phenomenal. Back in the day, core curriculum leaders would be given a budget, and the budget would be kind of, in most cases, separated between maths, reading, and if you were very lucky, writing as well. Obviously, that's changed somewhat, but in terms of not just your current role now, but in terms of your experiences, because I say you're fairly new, you're approaching 10 years, which isn't really, but in terms of the way that, the education system has been in the time that you've been teaching, do you find resourcing and kind of generating ideas to resource difficult, or is it quite a straightforward process for you?
I think it's quite subject specific. I find that there's a lot of different options for maths, for example, and priced at different rates as well. And there's different things that you can go with maths, and different options that you've got. I think for reading and writing, there's definitely resources out there, but it can be a little bit tricky in navigating those and trying to pick out the quality resources that are going to be have a real meaningful impact. And I think that can depend on the context that you've got, and the school that you've got, and the staff that you've got, but also the direction you want to take those subjects, which is always kind of informed by your cohort and your staff and the context that you're in. So I think it does depend on different subjects. I'm forever looking at different things and different options that you could kind of purchase if you wanted to, or the school had the budget for. And yeah, it's really interesting to see what's out there, and the different options that you've got, and the different directions that people have taken those resources in as well.
I think go on, sorry.
I think it's just difficult because it's not a one size fits all when it comes to reading or writing, and I think because those subjects have those complexities, it can be really important to just make sure that you're picking quality resources.
Well, I think reading's that for me, like reading's even as a class teacher when I wasn't involved in core curriculum, even sort of up to 2 years ago, I just remember having conversations with you about the books that were on the curriculum map. I didn't mention the name of it, but it was like these children just cannot relate to these characters, this particular timeline, to the language used. It's just completely alien to them, and it becomes pointless, really. And other times, you could pick up a book about a granny that's a little bit of a criminal, and then realize that someone in your class has had a death in the family of a grandparent, and that becomes that book becomes redundant because you don't want to bring up sort of emotional trauma. So I think reading is really difficult because it's the kind of the one resource that you stick with for a prolonged period of time in terms of a class book or kind of the reading skills element of the curriculum and stuff like that. So it becomes very difficult, I think, with reading. And I always found that really tough because if it's a book that you just like, this is just not going anywhere and it's really difficult to read and the kids aren't really relating to it, you can dress it up any way you want, but ultimately they've got to be kind of invested in the characters. And, we know as adults, we can pick up a book and you can just tell within the first chapter or whatever, that it's just not for you. And then you just kind of put it down and move on. So I always found with reading, it was always a bit tricky really in terms of resourcing. And it's the one that you kind of had to invest, more time and I suppose in some respects money to be able to generate new ideas and new sequences and stuff. So yeah, I always found the reading one quite tricky. And I think you're spot on when you say, the context of a cohort is vital because, the life experience we said earlier are kind of intrinsic in them understanding the text really. So yeah, it's a tough one. Yeah. We're going to go to news now. So stay with us. It's the latest news, education news from around the country. And when we come back, we will be talking a little bit more about how you kind of juggle your class commitments with your core curriculum commitments as well. So stay tuned, and we will be back on the Twilight Show with me, Ben Thomas, and my guest today, Becky Birchenough.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teacher Talk Radio News.
Schools Week reports the government is set to offer overseas teachers who come to England to teach languages or physics a £10,000 relocation premium under a new trial. The premium would be open to both trainee and established teachers working outside of the UK and would be paid at the end of their first term. Under the plan, there would be no need for the money to be paid back. The Department for Education said the trial could support up to 400 people to relocate, with the full cost adding up to £4 million. According to recent data, secondary school teacher recruitment targets have been missed for all but one of the past 10 years, and last year they fell short by 40%. The pilot for this new programme will run in the next academic year. In strike action news, industrial action has been suspended by NEU members in Wales. The action is halted whilst a new pay offer is considered. In a statement reported on a range of media platforms, NEU leaders in Wales said that following discussions with the Welsh Government, a new revised and fully funded pay offer will be put to members. The planned strike for the 15th and 16th of March will now not take place, although these dates remain for action in England and will continue to go ahead as planned. The revised offer for those teaching in Wales is said to be worth a total of 11.8%. The offer will be voted on by members of the NEU in Wales via electronic ballot. NEU leaders Dr Mary Bowstead and Kevin Courtney thanked the Welsh Government for the constructive approach to finding a resolution and contrasted it with the behaviour of Gillian Keegan, England's Secretary of State for Education. who they said was preventing talks in England by refusing talking to ACAS. Teachers in Scotland who are members of the EIS union have also voted to accept their latest pay offer. This will see a 7% rise backdated to April 2022, a further 5% next month, and another 2% in January. NASUWT members in Scotland have yet to vote on the offer. Student loans are back in the spotlight after changes to the system. Channel 4 reports that student loan repayments will rise for those in the next cohort of students in England, as the repayment threshold is to be dropped. The government has said this makes the loan system fairer for taxpayers and students, whilst education experts say it will make low to middle income graduates worse off. Current students will only make 9% repayments when they earn over £27,295 a year, or £2,274 a month, or £524 a week in the UK. However, if you're starting an undergrad course or qualify for an advanced learner loan on or after August the 1st, 2023, those students will pay 9% of their income over the lower threshold of £25,000 a year, £2,083 a month, or £480 per week. Students on the new plan won't be expected to make payments until April 2026, but the length of repayment is also changing. Current students pay until the debt is cleared or for 30 years, but new students will pay until the debt is cleared or for 40 years. Full details of the changes plus comments on the impact many believe it will have can be found on Channel 4's website, and all data has been subject to the outlet's fact-check system. Finally, a writer who wrote a book on the topic of online misogyny has given an interview to The Guardian. Laura Bates wrote Men Who Hate Women, The Extremism No One Is Talking About, and it was published in 2020. In the interview, she raises concerns about the widening gap between generations who have never known a world without the internet and those older generations struggling to understand and keep up. She talks in particular of the impact this is having on what she describes as the millions of girls who are realising the impossibility of escaping from harassment, revenge porn, deep fakes, and the difficulties in navigating a world online. Broadest form, not just an issue with influencers like Andrew Tate. In fact, she says she wasn't even aware of him until last year. This, she says, is worrying in itself, as there is a danger that the well-intentioned coverage will only boost his profile, and that if and when his influence wanes, many will think it is a case of problem solved, when actually the problems and attitudes that give rise to people like Tate will continue. Full details of the article can be found on the Guardian website. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
What I just realised is that I can mute the mic, and I've done, what is this, like the 5th or 6th show I've done now, and I've always, like, literally when the news has been on or whatever, and other people have been giving answers, I've literally just been sat here as still as I could, not realising that I could mute the mic. So absolutely ridiculous. There we go. But that's me all over, really. Right. So just had the news, and you were talking earlier about relocating. And I know that this is, this is to do with kind of overseas people coming in and relocating. I mean, 10 grand is still a lot of money to change, right? That's quite incredible. How would you have felt if someone said to you, right, Becky, you got to move to Reading, but you get 5K for that? Would that have softened the blow a little bit, or would it have kind of made the same thing?
I mean, I think the result would have been exactly the same, but I think, yeah, it would definitely soften the blow. I think it's very interesting when I said about the fact that I did my PGCE as a maths specialism, and the reasoning behind that was definitely because of my passion for maths. And it was only once I was on the course and accepted on the course that I then realised that the people who were not doing the maths specialism actually got a smaller amount of the bursary,
right, okay.
or something like that. And it was only once I'd kind of applied that I did that. And that it's very interesting how they are kind of trying to soften the blow for different people, whether that be a course to become a teacher training course, or relocation.
I mean, I remember they used to do things called golden handshakes, which weren't really aimed at primary sector. It was more to do with secondary schools. I think it was kind of late, I say noughties, but, kind of into the early 10s and 11s and stuff. And they were giving sort of like lump sums to people. I think it was lump sums, people that were doing kind of at risk, low take up subjects to teach. So, this is not the first time that the government have tried to bribe people, I don't know, with kind of money to teach in certain areas. I just think I'd be so interested to see how many people they get for 10 grand and relocating them from a different country to, to Blackburn or somewhere. No disrespect to anyone who's listening, Blackburn, by the way, but, it's an interesting concept of swapping, where they did live for a part in this country, really. So we'll see how that one pans out. But you think about all that news, and it is really money related, and it's kind of, that incentivizing in terms of the financial reward. And yet, we've got people going on strike this week over the next 2 days, and have been throughout the last 2 months on and off, to do with actual conditions of teachers that have been in the profession for a while, and people that have come into the profession new as well. So it's all a bit muddled, and it's all a bit bizarre. And I think, without getting too political, it just kind of shows where they're at, really, into clutching at straws. So it'll be interesting to see if they actually implement that 10 grand resettlement fee, I guess it is, but also how many people take it up. So yeah, we'll see. Right, where were we? So we left before we went to the news, talking about resourcing, really, weren't we? And I guess really the key question for you, Becky, because you do some fairly hefty jobs. How do you kind of juggle being in 6 effectively full time and your kind of core curriculum leadership as well? Like how do you manage your time? How do you manage your week? And how do you make sure that you get everything done, to the best of your ability?
It's very tricky for anyone working in schools. I think about managing their time and making sure that they use their time effectively. As the workload, we've discussed that. One of the things that I've started doing and has really made an impact is timetabling. So when I looked at the curriculum for the children and everything that we have to squeeze into a year, it can seem so overwhelming. But breaking it down into a timetable and being really quite strict with those times of, I've got half an hour to do this, I've got an hour to do this, everything all of a sudden slotted into place. So it's something that I've started doing with my own time before and after school, and timetabling that to make sure that if I've got a certain amount of tasks, I kind of try and get them all done. And I'm not saying that it works every time. It definitely doesn't. But it's something that's kind of helped me when it comes to prioritizing different tasks that I have to do within my role.
Yeah, I think the problem that we take it back to our context is that we're a small school. And so, with a one form entry school, in theory, it becomes a little bit more dependent on what other people are doing. So, obviously, if you need cover, it tends to be me or someone else that covers you. But then if you get hit with an absence on top of that, it kind of what that timetable would look like. And I always found that really difficult when I was a class teacher and I needed cover. That idea of kind of relying on other people to be able to come in and cover you or do bits and pieces with your class while you were able to go and monitor, because ultimately any leader really, in terms of subject, you can't really do the monitoring properly after the school day has ended, because as you said earlier, the driver now for most core subject leaders should be talking to the kids and kind of sharing in the learning and their experiences with them. So I think I found it really frustrating when I had to rely on other people to be able to cover me, or there was a problem doing that, because actually that juggling was really important, really. I mean, in terms of that timetable, do you find that and I know it's difficult to say from a class teaching point of view, but do you find that the core curriculum does take up quite a lot of your kind of week in terms of how you structure it? Or is it kind of one of those things that you've set up to a point where you know that you can just do kind of light touches every week or 2 weeks or whatever it is? Do you find that it is quite a time consuming part of your professional life?
Yeah, I think there's definitely over the cycle of an academic year, times where it can be more time consuming and then times where it can be more light touch. And it's about balancing that, particularly with a year 6 class who also go through a cycle of times when they're going to need a lot more of you, and then times where you can also kind of rely on those other people to cover. I think one of the huge benefits of being class-based and core curriculum is that I do it every day. I teach the subjects every day, so I know the challenges that the teachers are facing, and I also know the expectations that I'm setting are achievable and kind of can be shown and role modelled in that way. And that's a huge benefit because you know that where you're coming from is a position of understanding. So I like to try and phrase it that way as the benefits of it. And then I like to think about the different needs at different points in the year and how that can be kind of structured so that both kind of roles are met. But yeah, there's definitely times where I need to put a lot more into it, and my monitoring really needs to be the focus. And then there's definitely times where I can do more light touching and just kind of individualized work where I'm just working with maybe one teacher or one class just to support them.
Yeah, I mean it's it's a tricky one because if I I think back to my experiences, and I was last full time in the class 2 years ago, and I distinctly remember saying to Louisa probably around Easter of that year, just saying, look, in the nicest possible way, all the stuff that I'm having to do and monitor out of class, I feel like, to be blunt, my class is just getting in the way of that because I found it really difficult at that point to dedicate equal amounts of time, or rather kind of give more time to my class, because the amount of of kind of assessing and monitoring and looking at the whole school, and then kind of almost light touching my class. Obviously I wasn't in year 6. I'm not saying that that's a major deal breaker, but it wasn't a kind of a core assessment year. But also the school was in a very different place at that time. But I just distinctly remember having that conversation going, look, it is so difficult to juggle all of the whole school expectations that I've got and the roles I've got, and also teach a class full time. So, I often say, I've said it, being a leader, like a middle leader for any subject and full time is easily one of the hardest things I've ever done personally, professionally. So yeah, it's a challenge and it is difficult. And I think, speaking from experience, you're able to get that, you're able to strike that balance really, really well, which is key, really. I mean, I guess really, like, talking about the successes that you've had professionally, but also historically where your passion has lied in kind of lied. I don't know. I'm gonna get my grammar right. In maths, what for you now? What are your key drivers in education? Because obviously, you've been doing this for 8-9 years. What are your kind of goals, I guess, but also what's kind of driving you on at the moment to keep doing what you're doing? Because we hear all these stats about people leaving the profession in the first few years, and teacher recruitment crisis and all this sort of stuff. Like, what's doing it for you at the moment? Why do you keep doing what you're doing? Apart from the fact you work with me, obviously.
Apart from the fact I work with you, I mean, not to be soppy, but definitely the team that I'm working with is a factor in that.
Correct.
But I think it's just remembering the why, and like you kind of hinted at there, the passion that I have for it, and why we turn up every day, and why that's important to me. I was very lucky with some of the teachers that I had and some of the educational experiences that I had. And the more I speak to some of my teacher friends, I realise how that's not always the case. And then I think working in the schools that I've worked in, there's always been that element of trying to support these children who don't have a different economic background to others, and to maybe don't have those experiences that other children do have. And I think that's been a big motivator in what I do. And then when it comes to the leadership of the core curriculum, the more I do it, the more I realise how supporting those members of staff can have that wider impact in the whole school life, and how you can have an impact in that whole school ethos and culture, and how important that is to everybody who works there, who learns there, who visits there, and how you can really contribute towards that, and the importance of that for all of those stakeholders involved. So yeah, that would be a big motivator right now, is just thinking about how those children get that quality education, and particularly where we are in a primary school, how we're setting those children up for their whole career in education. You know they're going to go on to a secondary school where they're going to have to make choices on maybe which subjects they study, and that's going to have an impact on their lives, and you know that you want to set them up for success.
I think, without going down the whole secondary school ready phrase, which is awful, there is an element of truth in that. We talk regularly about children and kind of the experiences that they have with us, but also kind of what their experiences will look like when they move to secondary school. And that's obviously a massive consideration in terms of what we do, in terms of, getting them ready for that emotionally and academically, but also making sure that the change isn't too much of a shock for them. So yeah, I kind of get that. It's a really important part of what we do. I mean, in terms of where you're at, do you, because some people like leading the subject, they're just not keen on the kind of the whole get up and talk to people and present stuff. Do you find that part of your role enjoyable and kind of leading that whole school development process? Is that something that you kind of relish?
Yeah, I think there's definitely people who kind of shy away from that maybe. But no, I think I enjoy it because it's what interests me, and it kind of what gets me going a little bit. So when it comes to maths and English and things like that, I think I like talking about it, and I like, which is why I said I'd do the podcast. I think it
Not because I
definitely
literally I need someone like, can you just come on and talk about
it. But yeah, no, it definitely interests me, and I like the intricacies of it and the different things and directions that schools can go. And I've been on a few different journeys with different schools about their school development and how different they are, and the different successes and achievements you have professionally within that, both yourself and as a group of staff. I think, and a lot of that can be around the curriculum as well as other parts of school life. I mean, the curriculum's just one part of it. But I like the different discussions, and I like hearing other people's kind of opinions or ideas or different directions that they've taken on it. So yeah, I like those kind of public discussions and forums where you can talk about things like that. And I've never really been too nervous about, in terms of, public speaking or anything like that about it, because I always just kind of see it as an opportunity to kind of gain that understanding a little bit more. And yeah, really have that contribution to a wider school kind of culture and ethos.
Ultimately it's about sharing best practice in the most effective way that not you personally, but just generically in terms of a core curriculum leaders can, and how, as you said earlier, about getting the intent and the message across, and ultimately, as I said, kind of sharing that best practice element, which is really, really important. Talking of sharing best practice, here is a message from our sponsors, John Catt. So stay with us. We'll be right back to close out the Twilight show with me, Ben Thomas, in just a few seconds.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
And what a catalogue it is. There's loads of titles on there. So, go and check it out. Have a look. There will definitely be something that you will be able to use in your schools and in your professional development as well. So, that's John Catt. Have a look at their bookshop online and see what you can pick up. Right, Becky, we're kind of, amazingly, we're sort of right to the end of the show pretty much. And the one thing that we haven't talked about really, we talked about challenges of your current role. We did that earlier on in the show. But one thing we didn't talk about really is kind of the core curriculum as a as a whole. So if you were kind of, I don't know, a red kite and you were looking down on the core curriculum, it being your prey, for example. I mean, this is a really rubbish analogy, but bear with me. What would you kind of say was the main challenges of the core curriculum in this kind of current education setup across the UK? Is that a big enough question? Is that like a large enough question for you?
That is a massive question, yeah. I like the red kite analogy as well. I like them since I moved to Reading. I think in terms of, there's lots of different ways you could take this. In terms of the subject leadership of those core curriculum subjects, I've definitely noticed kind of a shift in the, I want to say, of accountability or responsibility for them. I mean, I kind of briefly spoke about how the first Ofsted that I went through, the experiences that I had there, and they were very, very different to the experiences that I've had in more recent Ofsted with the Ofsted framework as it is, and how detailed you have to kind of talk about those subjects and the information and the data you have to have, not children's data, but the information that you have to have on those subjects and the grasp of that subject that you have to have. And kind of sitting alongside that is also the changes that have happened to the curriculum itself. So, we've kind of, over the 8 years that I've gone through, if we look at maths, for example, the very first time I teach maths and people would kind of shiver in horror at it now is with the 4-way differentiation, and you're going to do this sheet and you're going to do this sheet. And, the idea of concrete resources was kind of starting to be talked about, but wasn't really evident in a lot of different lessons. And, when I went to university, they were talking about, you could do this, but, if you differentiate this way, you don't kind of have to, kind of thing. And the subject, how that's developed now, and the idea of mastery within the maths. And then also now when we talk about adaptive teaching and how we kind of structure it that way. And so I think it's an ever-changing landscape that you've kind of got to respond to. And you kind of have to look at those and navigate those and making it applicable to the children and the context that you're in, which is also constantly changing. And now we talk about the pandemic and the impact that had, particularly on the children and their learning. And then you can talk about the cost of living crisis and how different experiences that you wanted to do with children maybe now aren't always as accessible. So I think it's about the constant change and just keeping on top of that. And at the same time, you're keeping on top of your curriculum and your monitoring, and you're trying to maintain those standards in an ever-changing world.
I think that's a good point about the changes and the kind of, you talked about adaptive teaching and the 4-way differentiation, stuff like that. But like, that's kind of, to me, that's always what, good leadership looks like, in terms of, right, I've got all this information, I've got to change all this like yesterday. So what's your kind of key priority, and how are you going to kind of drip feed, but also kind of shield people from, the kind of like another analogy, but like the monsoon of information that's coming through, like what are you going to focus on first of all, and how are you going to, always coming back to that intent that you mentioned earlier, and the kind of the roadmap and stuff, like what are the key elements of it. So that that's a really good point in terms of, even in your career, how stuff's changed and moved on, and the kind of the expectations of external sources to be able to use this stuff regularly, and also make an impact, basically. So it's a really, really interesting point about that, in terms of how how those things are kind of fed into a school's culture, and how they become the norm, and the children can relate to it, and they can talk about it, and they can access it, and ultimately kind of make progress for their age group and what they're needing. So yes, it's a really good point, that coming away from the job that you do, and the the roles that you hold professionally, like what do you do away from teaching to not be a teacher 24/7, basically? Because I've worked with those people that are just they're brilliant teachers, but they are just all in, like they don't switch off, they don't stop, they're constantly in education forums and marking and all this sort of stuff. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but in terms of what do you do to kind of wind down, to relax, to kind of switch off from being a year 6 teacher, but also a core curriculum lead?
Yeah, I find it really important to switch off and kind of look after myself, and make sure that you're getting that time, like you said, to kind of fill your cup up, so that then you can go to school and give everything. So I think one of the things that I've kind of always been a little bit interested in is sport, and being active and exercise and things like that. So whether that's watching sport, I spend a lot of my time watching sport, or the documentaries you can watch about sport, but also yoga. And I've recently started running a lot, because I got a new watch, and it tells me that my cardio fitness was not as good as it should be. So I've started trying to run a lot more, which means that I'm trying to read a
It
lot
says
more.
your cardio fitness isn't good.
Yeah. So
Does it?
yeah. So I had to reflect a little bit on my cardio fitness, because a lot of the time I go to the gym, and I like to do a lot of like weightlifting and things like that. I was not always keen on cardio work. So I've started trying to read a lot more about running, to kind of motivate myself to run.
I think with running, like I've kind of been in and in love and hated running for so many years, but ultimately the only advice I could give anyone running is just get out and do it, because you never regret going for a run, right? So
No.
it's actually booting up and then getting out of the house to do it, and once you're doing it, it's fine. If you go 1K, great. If you go 10K, fantastic. Whatever it is, like, you never ever regret a run. So it's kind of, it's one of those things where one of the things that I've experienced most is just getting out and doing it. And once you're there, you're fine. I'm fascinated by this. You're going to have to show me this watch, though. That it just came up and said your cardio is rubbish, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be based on your VO2 max, which I think is very hard to measure.
Right, okay,
It says it might be hard to measure, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, because, I mean, like you said, you never regret a workout, but I always favoured kind of weightlifting in the gym. I never favoured cardio work, so
yeah.
something I've reflected on. That was my New Year resolution, but it's become a bit bigger thing now that the evenings are lighter and I've got a bit more time to run. I don't like running in the dark.
And then, that's the thing. It's been so cold as well. Like, it's just been like not
so cold.
Used to good running weather.
Yeah.
And obviously all the snow and stuff like that. So it's not been ideal, really.
Yeah.
And like, away from exercise, what are you kind of watching on? I'm not going to mention any streaming services, but what are you watching on stuff at the moment? Do you have time for TV or films or whatever?
Yeah, I like TV. I like to go to the cinema if I'm going to watch a film, because I like to see it on the big screen. But yeah, I like TV, and I'm excited because tomorrow Ted Lasso comes back out, and I absolutely
Is it tomorrow? Does it come back tomorrow?
Yeah, season 3 is tomorrow, and I absolutely adore Ted
Right.
Lasso.
So one of the things I really like is kind of reading about and learning about different styles of leadership. And for people that have not watched Ted Lasso, you might have seen this. It's kind of, it is about a football team, but you can watch it and not be absorbed in the football. Like it does a really good job of kind of basically using the human element, I think, and then the kind of sporting element separately. Like they're not, although they're linked, they're not like intrinsically linked, if that makes sense. So anyone listening to this, I'm not plugging like a major studio TV show that they've spent millions of pounds doing, but it is really good. Like people I know who can't stand football have gone, oh yeah, Ted Lasso, like I love it. So yeah, I would highly recommend, if you have access to a certain streaming service, to go and watch season 1 and 2 if you haven't already. But yeah, the new one comes back tomorrow. I didn't know that. That's
The
how
new one's
exciting.
out tomorrow. And it never fails to put a smile on my face, that show.
This is it, right? And he's a really good leader because he gets across his message really, really well, I think, anyway. So, yeah. And the Mandalorian as well, that's back tomorrow, isn't it?
Mando is back, yeah, so that'll be
next episode
tomorrow.
All this exciting stuff to look forward to. How amazing. Becky, listen, thank you so much for joining me on Tuesday Twilight Show. Have you enjoyed it?
I have enjoyed it. Like I said, I could talk about curriculum forever. So
this is the thing, though, isn't it? People will obviously listen live now, but people listen to this back, and there are so many good points that you've made about leadership of the core curriculum, but also like your passion for it and your enjoyment for it really comes through. And I think hopefully there'll be people listening to this that are just starting out in their core curriculum leadership or any subject leadership really. And I think you've given some really good, clear insights into how you manage that really important job, but also kind of how you get the best results out of the whole school really. So, thank you so much for, for wasting your Tuesday evening and jumping on and talking about it. I really appreciate it. Hope we can get you on again at some point.
No, thank you.
Right. Well, thank you so much for listening, everybody. I really appreciate that. And, it's good to see kind of the interactions popping up on my screen and all the different people coming in and stuff. It means a lot. And I hope that you've kind of enjoyed the premise and ultimately you've learned something out of it. There's a lot of good shows coming up this week. We've got, let me have a look. I always get to this point. I go, but I can't remember what we're doing. What have we got? Let's have a look. Hold on. Filler. We've got Nathan Ginn. He's back this Thursday. He's talking to Dan Smith. And this is a really good question, actually. What's the smallest thing that you've changed about your teaching that's had the biggest impact? That's a really, really big question. So he's going to be back on Thursday evening, I believe. We have got Poppy Gibson in a couple of weeks. She's talking about adopted children, impact on education, which will be a fun one. John Gibbs, friend of the show, and I was actually on the weekly review, which you can watch back. I was with him on Sunday. Fantastic insight, really, really experienced guy. He's on the morning break with John Gibbs, ironically. And he's talking about making sense of race and education. So that'd be really, really good. He's got Dr. Sharon Fraser Burgess, which will be quite interesting. So she's on that one with him as well. And obviously, if you've been listening to this, we've been talking about core curriculum leadership with my very special guest, Becky Birchenough. I'll be back in a few weeks' time talking about something completely different. I can't remember what it is, but I'm sure it'll be interesting, hopefully. Have a really good end of the week. Enjoy it. We're nearly at Easter, and I will see you very soon.
Thank you for having me.
No problem at all.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.
This show is brought